I'm Chi Kim, and I am the CEO of Pure Edge. I'm very, very excited today to introduce to you a wonderful team from Stanford. As you may know, in this past 2 weeks, a study was released based on a research project that Stanford Medicine and this team, as well as another team, Dr. O'Hara's sleep team, was found that Pure Power curriculum actually helped increase sleep for students that were in the study. And so we're really excited just to have this incredible group. So I'd like to go ahead and have them come on screen. We're going to introduce Dr. Victor Carrión. And welcome, Victor. Dr. Ryan Matlow, Dr. Travis Bradley, and Susana Cruz, who is joining us from Spain. So we've got a nice, beautiful collection of experts and really warm and welcoming practitioners. So we want to just go ahead and get started to honor your time. And again, this is integrating social emotional learning for academic success, a comprehensive approach. And one of the things that we've actually talked about was really trying to figure out, when we're going back into school, what are some of the things that we need to think about as we are creating conditions for success? And so in order for us to do that, we just want to start with just modeling some of the things that we think are super helpful. And then again, at the very end of this session, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well. So we're going to go ahead and just let you know how we're sort of grounding this. We're really talking about building conditions for success by building a feeling of belonging. We do know that when you feel safe and secure, especially for young children, that all of their cognitive load can be focused on learning and really focused on trying to learn the content at hand. If they feel unsafe, if we as humans feel unsafe, we're very likely not to have our full presence in whatever environment that we're in. And so in terms of your school-based models, relationships and experiences, your student-teacher relationships, and general feelings about school are really how students really feel like they belong. And you know that better than anyone in this audience. You know what supports are needed. We also know that having these strong connections are really great predictors for having a system of and a culture of care. And what does belongingness look like as outcomes? We know that the academic outcomes are pretty robust, and they're very, using the data, less absenteeism, better school completion, less truancy, positive attitude, and then also academic self-efficacy. We do know that. We also know there's pro-social outcomes, that there are higher levels of happiness and just adjustment, self-esteem, identity. When you feel like you belong, you, as I said before, you're completely focusing your cognitive load on just the learning environment and being able to really attend to tasks. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Susana.
Thank you very much, Chi. Hello and welcome everyone. We're going to do 2 mindfulness exercises in this webinar. One is going to be now at the beginning, and the other one is going to be towards the end. You don't need to know anything about mindfulness, and you don't need to be an expert, because I'm going to guide you through this exercise. And the first question is why we're going to do this mindfulness exercise in this webinar. It's because we would like you to take care. We would like to take care of yourself. We would like you to take care of yourself. We would like to take care. We would like to take care of you, and we would like you to work on your self-care, because when you work on your self-care, you can take care of others, and the more you work on your self-care, the better you take care of others. So we're going to do these practices, mindfulness, very easy, and so that you can start taking care of yourself. So the first step towards self-care is a self-check. So these emojis here are lots of show a lot of emotions, and there's going to be a poll. I don't know if a poll is coming out here, and we would like you to answer which of these emotions represent best how are you feeling right now, but just right now, not an hour ago, not yesterday, but just now. and you can answer from 1 to 10. And there's no, you don't have to feel one way or another. It's just how are you feeling right now. We give you a minute to answer it, in a couple of seconds, to answer the poll. How are you feeling just right now? Just a self-check. Oh, so there is 1, 2, 3, lots of emotions here, a variety of emotions. Interesting, all different. And very nice. That's good that we all feel a different way in different moments. So it's good that you have done this self-check. And now we are going, after this self-check, we're going to, I'm going to guide you. I don't know if there's going to be a slide. We're changing the presentation. Who's Elizabeth? Are you? I'm not sure if you're going to share a screen. Okay, I will. I can share it. Oh, here it is. Thank you. So we're going to do a mindful minute. This is one of the activities that PureEdge offers in their library of brain breaks. Brain breaks are exercises that you could do anytime, anywhere, and this will only take a minute. So for this exercise, you need to, I'm going to guide you, and you need to be, you can be sitting down or standing up or lying down. And I'm going to do it both in English and Spanish, because I think there are lots of Spanish speakers here. So I think sometimes it's nice to hear your own language and to do these exercises in your own language, because it's good for the brain and for the exercise and for the learning as well. So, en una postura cómoda, with legs and arms uncrossed, brazos y piernas sin cruzar, sentados, de pie o tumbados. Si tienen un sofá cerca, if you have a couch available, you can lay down. You can close your eyes if you feel comfortable. Cierren los ojos si se sienten cómodos. Or keep a soft gaze. Tengan una mirada tranquila y relajada, con los ojos entornados. Y centren su atención poco a poco en su respiración. Bring your attention to your breathing, how the air fills the body and how the air comes out of the body. Centren su atención en cómo el aire entra en su cuerpo, la inhalación, y cómo el aire sale, inhalando y exhalando, breathing in and breathing out. So bring your attention to your breathing. Bring your attention to your thoughts. Pongan su atención en sus pensamientos. Bring your attention to your feelings. Lleven la atención a sus emociones. And bring your attention to your body. Y también a su cuerpo. Lleven la atención a su cuerpo. So we have all these things: breathing, emotions, thoughts, and body. And I leave you for a minute to be with all these things so that your attention will focus on these things. Les dejo durante un minuto con sus pensamientos, emociones, su respiración y su cuerpo durante un minuto. Inhalando y exhalando, breathing in and breathing out. We are halfway there. Estamos a medio camino del minuto. Before closing this minute, antes de cerrar este minuto, I would like you to read a poem that I believe is a kind of representation of this webinar for this new transition period. And it goes like this. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act. Just once, with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. This poem is from Rainer Maria Rilke, Letters to a Young Poet. So slowly and gently, you can open your eyes, move your body, your fingers slowly, and come back to this webinar, to the screen, slowly and gently. You can practice these brain breaks, these exercises anytime, anyway, anywhere, and it's easy. It only takes 1 minute. This time it's a little bit more than a minute, but just with 1 minute, it could be enough to calm down your brain and your body. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Now I'm happy to introduce you to Dr. Carrión, who is going to talk about stress, neuroplasticity, and adaptability.
Thank you, Susana. And thank you for really starting the meeting today with a mindful exercise. It's a really good way of modeling how really is helpful to start a lot of meetings so that we can all anchor in the present moment. I want to thank Pure Edge and Chi Kim for inviting us to spend this time with you all. I want to thank you all in the audience for joining us today. We at the Early Life Stress program at Stanford have been very concerned, as I'm sure many of you are, on what this experience of this past year has been like for the children that we work with and all children. And it has been very varied. And in the same way that children get very excited during the summer to come and share their experiences at school, I think they're going to be coming to school to really talk about their narratives and their stories about this past year and everything that has happened. And all of us are going to really be facing the whole gamma of reactions. We are going to have children that for them this was a very normative experience, and we're going to have children that really have experienced trauma. And what we hope to do today is to really prepare you to face all of that spectrum of reactions that you are going to have with children, and more importantly, to know what resources are available to you, including your own body, right? Your main coping tool in being able to help those around you and help yourself, because before we know it, right, kids will be back here in school, and many of you might already be involved in summer programs. I was talking about this big gamma, big spectrum of experiences that children have. We know that more than 100,000 children in the nation have lost a caretaker. A lot of them have also lost educators. So there is grief also involved in these narratives that we are going to talk about and that they are going to talk about. What we are going to notice in these narratives, in the stories, and what we have experienced ourselves is stress, which is actually something that we were experiencing before the pandemic, is something that we will experience after the pandemic. So one of the goals for today is to talk about stress and to talk about what it is and how can we benefit from it. And when it gets to be too heavy, when it gets to be too much, how to handle that. We'll be doing a big chunk here of very basic biology so that we can understand then the link between this outside experience of stress and how that translates into our body, so that one of the best ways to control it is to really acknowledge and know what's going on. We will then talk about interventions for those kids that need it, from preventive interventions like the one Susanna just gave us on mindfulness and yoga, and preventive interventions like the brain breaks that Pure Edge has, all the way to treatments like the Q Center approach that we use at Stanford for children that have been traumatized. And then how to really apply all of this in a way that helps us in our thoughts and in our emotions, so that we can become even better than resilient, so that we can become adaptable, meaning that we not only bounce back to where we were, but we may bounce back to a better place. So let's get started. Next slide, please. The first thing to know about stress is that it really operates in an inverted U-curve shape fashion. And what we see here is that our happiness, our health, our performance improves as we gather more stress. Is what in psychology we call eustress. Because many systems, including our immunological system, develop because they get prompted by the availability of stressors. Our coping skills, our coping tools develop because we are stressed, right? But that only happens up to an optimal level. Here at the peak, we see the area of optimal stress. When stress starts to accumulate because it's not being managed, or because it's coming from many different ways, and we can say that in 2020, we really had more than the pandemic, right? We had political divides, we had racial issues, hate crimes, we had natural disasters, the usual culprits of trauma. When it starts getting too heavy, what we see then is that we see that performance, that happiness, that health decline. And when we talk about traumatic stress, when we talk about post-traumatic reactions, when we talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, when we talk about toxic stress, we are talking about this second part of the curve. Next slide, please. And I'll give you some examples of what these experiences do to children. Traumatic experiences can be both natural disasters, but can also be man-made. And here we see an example of a drawing of a child that has experienced war. And when children experience trauma, one of the things that happen is that something that is very valuable to them gets robbed by the trauma, and that is play. And play turns into traumatic play. And we recognize traumatic play because A is repetitive and B is non-joyful. And if you see the expressions in these faces of the children in this drawing, what you see are expressions of horror, really, rather than enjoyment because of the traumatic play. Next slide, please. Here is another example of man-made trauma, terrorism. This is a picture as depicted by a 9-year-old after 9/11. And this demonstrates the ability that children have to tell the story in more than one way. This was a child that really never drew before. He would always just talk or play. But after 9/11, he found that the only way he really could express what he had experienced was by doing this drawing. Next slide, please. Natural disasters are another example. This is a 5-year-old that survived a Haiti earthquake, but here she's depicting how she and her younger sister were the only ones that actually survived that natural disaster. The rest of the family, unfortunately, perished during that earthquake. Next slide. And the subject that most of our research takes place and that I'm going to talk to you about mostly when I talk about cortisol and brain imaging and so forth is interpersonal violence. This is physical abuse, this is sexual abuse, this is witnessing violence. This tends to be chronic. It tends to be more than one incident, and it impacts, like all the other traumas, it impacts our mind and our body. Next slide. And of course, the experience that we've all had this year of a world pandemic affecting all of us universally. And that is something to remember when we welcome the kids back and when they start telling us their stories, that we all have this universal experience, but then we also have very personal experiences. And it is important to get to those personal experiences. For some children, they had the resources that were available to them to be protected, right? They understood what was happening because they were being educated, and they felt safe, and they felt at times content, and they felt connected to their nuclear family. But for many others, that connection was lost, or that content was not there, and they may not feel safe. The younger the kids are, the more concrete they are, and the more difficult it might have been for them to understand why they couldn't go and visit grandparents, for example. And many of them may have internalized that and may have thought, well, is there something wrong with me that I cannot go and do that? Or is there something wrong with my friend or my family member that I cannot see? So education, right, it was very important during this time. But another example of something else that gets added to this accumulated trauma that could make us shift to this second half of the curve. Next slide, please. So the battle between nature and nurture is pretty much over. We know it's really the combination of genes and environment that impact the vulnerability that we all have to stress. We all have different genes, we all have different experiences, and of course the combination of both of these in many of us is going to be very different as well, and may lead to different outcomes. For some of them, that may be what we call resilience. For some of them, it may be conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder. And for others, it would be anxiety and depression and other things. A note here about resilience. We tend to talk about resilience as it's a physics term, right? It's the ability to bounce back, like a coil bounces back. But in psychology, we really use it to to speak about no symptoms present, right? That there was no PTSD, no anxiety, no depression. But if for a second you could think of a threshold model, and you can think that below that threshold is where you have no symptoms, and above that threshold is where you have symptoms and behavioral issues and academic problems. What we have below is the true resilient, right? Individuals that bounce back. But we also have individuals that, because of their gene and environments combination, they happen to be below the threshold. But as experiences accumulate, they get closer and closer and closer to that threshold. And right now we're calling those individuals also resilient, when in fact, it may be the next event that really makes them cross that threshold and have problems. So we need ways really to identify those that are most vulnerable, that need preventive interventions. So a good approach to do before we can recognize the two groups, the resilient and the one that accumulates, is provide prevention methods for the whole group under that threshold. Next slide, please. So it's really a miracle that things go well so many times. There's a lot happening during early brain development. 100 billion neurons are forming trillions of synapses. Earlier on, there's some pruning of some networks that don't get used that much. And then throughout development, there's myelination to make those connections go faster. So anything that stresses the system in a positive way will help it do this whole orchestration. But if we're on that second part of the curve, it can really impact the networks that get developed. And we will talk about some networks that actually are not performing that well when kids are exposed to stress, traumatic stress specifically. But we will also be talking about this plasticity that the brain has that allows all of us, through interventions, to be able to protect that brain while it's developing, and actually sometimes even reverse some of the outcomes that we see. Next slide. The first thing I want to talk about in terms of the biology is a hormone that we secrete when we are stressed. If we're going to cross the street and a truck is coming right at us, we're going to jump out of there, right? And that's what happens when cortisol gets released and epinephrine and other hormones get released. Cortisol helps us manage stress, all kinds of stress. Even after lunch, our cortisol goes up to help us with digestion. But if you're feeling like a truck is coming at you more days than not, then that is going to sensitize this whole system that ends up being the secretion of cortisol in the adrenal glands on top of our kidneys, but that begins with our brain. It begins with the hypothalamus. This is a very good example of the connection between the brain and the rest of our body. Biology really doesn't separate these two. It's all in harmony, and it all impacts each other, because that cortisol that gets released also goes back to the brain and sends a message and gives feedback on how cortisol is being regulated. If there's too much, if there's too little, how much sensitivity the receptors should have. But if there is too much cortisol, this can be a problem. And we know this from animal research that has shown that there's neurotoxicity when increased levels of cortisol happen. So we wanted to see what these cortisol levels were in children that were on that second half of the curve. Next slide, please. And what we have found as a biological marker of post-traumatic stress in children is that prior to bedtime, there are very elevated levels of cortisol. This does not seem to be adaptive. It's actually that puts kids at risk. We see the normal circadian rhythmicity that we see with this hormone, which is very high at the beginning of the day, right? It kind of gets us going for the day, and it slowly decreases. But in children that have post-traumatic stress symptoms, what we see is an increase before bedtime. Next slide, please. And our concern is, what does that do to sensitive areas of our brain? Areas like the amygdala, where we process emotions, like the hippocampus, where we process memories, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for our executive function. The amygdala and the hippocampus are part of what we call the limbic system. They're very connected. Sometimes only one neuron separates them. That's why some emotions bring us memories and some memories brings us emotions. But they're also very rich in these cortisol receptors, meaning that if cortisol is elevated, that's where they're gonna go. The prefrontal cortex also has glucocorticoid receptors. So we were very interested in seeing, well, what's happening to these regions when individuals are under stress. But I like showing this picture also because what it also depicts besides these, fancy brain regions is the senses. We can see the skin, we can see the nose, the mouth, the eyes, and these are the windows. These are the windows to our central nervous system. And when we talk about cue-centered therapy, these are the cues. The cues come in through our senses. So we will be talking a little bit more about that later today. But I want you, when we look at a child and we're talking about the brain, to not forget that we are really talking about where does this information processing begins, and it does begin in the senses. Next one. One of the things that we did is we wanted to see how the hippocampus was functioning in these children that have high levels of cortisol. And what we see here is the comparison of a healthy group of kids that are probably on that first half of the curve, compared to kids that are on the second half of the curve. And the yellow depicts a hippocampus that is more functional and working significantly more optimal function in the healthy kids with not significant amount of traumatic stress. We did this because we had seen that actually there were correlations that were very insidious between increased level of that pre-bedtime cortisol and what was happening in the volume of the hippocampus. Next slide, please. And here is the same information depicted by what we call voxels, which are areas of the brain on an imaging scan. And what we see is that the healthy kids, the light green bar, is significantly engaging more of the hippocampus than on the kids that have post-traumatic stress symptoms. Next slide, please. So what about the prefrontal cortex? And this is very important to all of you educators because it's where we process information, it's where we organize, it's where we really, is this area in front of the corpus callosum, which is that white matter region that you see there in the middle. And it also has important links with that limbic system, right? There's frontal limbic connections that happening a lot. So next slide, please. When we look at activity that happens in the prefrontal cortex, what we see is that the prefrontal cortex is also important to work as a brake on the amygdala. So those frontal limbic connections, some of them are between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The amygdala becoming aroused when there's anxiety, when there's fear, when there's stress, and the prefrontal cortex saying, oh no, this is okay. You know, the truck passed by and you're safe now, right? And what we see is that after you experience a significant amount of stress and you have post-traumatic stress symptoms, that amygdala becomes also hypersensitive. And here on a task where people can view angry faces, which stresses them, what we see in red is that the children that have post-traumatic stress symptoms have an amygdala that is more sensitive and more active very early on in the process. So what it needs is a good break, right? A good prefrontal cortex. But on the next slide, if we look at the activity of that prefrontal cortex, next slide, please. What we see is that it is not as active, that in fact is not working as well. So these are impacts that stress has potentially through this increase in cortisol mechanism. And what we see now when viewing fearful faces is that there's a diminished prefrontal cortex activation in the kids that have post-traumatic stress symptoms. Next slide, please. Now, all of that sounds like bad news, right? But it's only one side of the coin. What it's also doing is inviting us to look at the other side of the coin. Because if environment can have that amount of impact in our physiology and in our brain, maybe it does have that also for positive, good, nurturing information that gives us safety, content, and connectedness, okay? Now, the good thing is that these areas I've been talking about, both the cortical areas and the limbic areas, are some of the most plastic areas of the brain. That means, what plasticity means, is that they are actually able to reorganize themselves. And those myelinization and connections that I was talking about can actually repair themselves and can work themselves. And guess what? One of the best things to help this area, especially the cortical area and the limbic area, is exercise. Exercise both of the mind and the body. And this is one good thing about yoga, that in yoga, we're doing both body exercise, but also mind exercise. So it can help the neuroplasticity that we have, and it's probably having an impact on those sleep findings that I'm going to share with you later, but that Chi Kim was referring to at the beginning of this. Next slide. So neuroplasticity is most active during development. So working with kids is a good thing. It's a good thing to actually get this going. As I mentioned, aerobic exercise promotes this neurogenesis. The best improvements happen to be in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, and it kind of makes sense, right? They were the most vulnerable areas, but they also can have the best improvements. And this is not only happening at the level of the nerve connections, like I was talking about, but also the molecular level of what's happening inside the cell, how healthy a cell is. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did is, okay, we need to improve the function of the prefrontal cortex, and we need to improve the function of the hippocampus and amygdala. So in other words, we need to improve executive function, and we need to improve emotion regulation. And we need to improve this in children that are experiencing trauma as we are working with them. So we can concentrate on the trauma, or we can concentrate on their empowerment. And we can empower them through knowledge so that they can understand, what's happening. Many children get the message that they're a problem, that they're bad, that they're crazy. And what's worse, they believe it, right? They believe it because they haven't been given the appropriate information that when bad things happen to us, many of us have reactions to those traumas. So we wanted to educate in a way that would enhance executive function, that would enhance emotion regulation, and that would actually make the individuals feel that they're their best coping tool, which is very fortunate since wherever you go for the rest of your life, that's something you're going to have with you, is you and your body. We developed a treatment protocol that addresses all of that, and we call that cue-centered therapy. And Dr. Ryan Madlow is going to talk to us more about that, and I'm going to take you through a case of cue-centered therapy so that you can see what we're talking about. And but what's really important is that in our first randomized controlled trial, we not only saw this decrease of symptoms, right, which correlates with improvement in executive function and emotion regulation, but look at the slope of the beginning of the treatment. In those early sessions, there's nothing fancy happening in terms of therapy. A lot of what's happening there is education. It's really giving information to kids, letting them know what classical conditioning is, letting them know that sometimes we learn things that were adaptive at one time that our body gets stuck on with, but then later become maladaptive because we don't need to use them because we're not in the same threatening situation, but our body misreads them as threatening. So very important, that piece of education in what we call CCT. Next slide, please. So one of the things that happens that we know from our prior research when we do imaging and brain imaging is that increased activation of an area of the prefrontal cortex called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex correlates heavily with symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Using another methodology, not MRI, but something we call FNIRS, near infrared spectroscopy, which is like a swimming cap that gives us information on what's happening in the cortical areas of the brain, we saw that children that were going through CCT treatment were actually decreasing that hyperactivation that they had in that region and providing empirical evidence to the usefulness of the tools and objectives of the treatment that we're going to share with you today. Next slide. But that's when children already are manifesting symptoms, right? What do we do to protect them from before they develop those symptoms? Well, we partner with Pure Edge in developing a curriculum that involves both yoga and mindfulness in what we call Pure Power. This curriculum is available free in English and Spanish at the Pure Edge website, and it's a significant tool for those schools that have the ability to put it into action. Okay, next slide. And we did a study where we actually looked at academics, behaviors, brain function, and sleep in children that went through this curriculum. It was a randomized study. It was also a controlled study, meaning that there was a whole district where this intervention was not happening that was also being assessed. A lot of this data has been collected already, all of it really. And we're now going through the process of analyzing it. And today I'm going to talk about the sleep data that just got reported and some of the preliminary brain function data. So this is data from children that have done yoga and mindfulness for a span of 2 to 3 years, only twice a week, maybe sometimes 15 minutes, maybe sometimes 30 or 40 minutes. Next slide, please. And what we are very excited about is that we're seeing an increase of sleep in those children that went through the intervention. Now, this is very important because a lot is happening during sleep. I started earlier telling you these kids have high levels of cortisol pre-bedtime, and not surprisingly, a lot of the behaviors they experience associated with fear and anxiety happen at nighttime, happen during that time. Fear of the dark, nightmares, wetting of the bed, not being able to sleep, right? All of these things, and lack of sleep. And what we know is that not only they are sleeping more, next slide please, but they're sleeping better, because during rapid eye movement sleep and during deep sleep of the stages of non-REM sleep is when we process the emotions of the day, is when we actually are able to encode in our brain, probably in our hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, a story, a narrative of what happened to us in the day. With the lack of that deep sleep, we're not able to process that. And what happens to that information is that it just stays there and may manifest in more problems later on. And we see it very clearly when a kid comes to class and they haven't slept well, right? They're tired. They cannot process information as well as when they get a good night's sleep. So we're very excited about Pure Power's impact on sleep. And cortisol seems to play a role on this as well. It seems that it regulates the cortisol better so that they can sleep better. Next slide. Part of the reason why they might also be sleeping better is because their amygdala may not be as activated. Here in the purple and brown bars, the second ones, where we see the groups that went through the intervention compare to kids that were not in the intervention, we see that there was a significant amygdala reactivity, but that with at time 1, right before the intervention, but at time 2, once the intervention was underway, there was a significant decrease of that amygdala activity. And that's good, because that means that that balance between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala I was talking about earlier, it's actually improving, it's actually working better at this time in kids that do not even have symptoms, but in kids that are already at a neuroscientific level are demonstrating increased amygdala reactivity. Next slide, please. So what do we do with this information? I told you what we did in terms of executive function and in terms of emotion regulation. We built CCT and we're going to share that with you. But I want to talk for a second about the importance of positive thoughts, which is part of how our executive function improves. Negative thoughts are also called automatic thoughts. There are thoughts associated with depression, with fear, with anxiety. Evolutionarily, negative thoughts have been very helpful, right? If we felt that that lion was going to come at us and eat us, we would get onto a tree and we would protect ourselves. But as life has become safer in a way, it has been very difficult for our brain to give up those negative thoughts. So those negative thoughts continue to be automatic. Sometimes when we have a lot of negative thoughts, they create a chain that leads to depression and leads to anxiety. So the best way to fight a negative thought is with a positive one, is with a positive thought. However, Positive thoughts are not automatic. They need to be practiced. So when Susanna tells us to take that minute to really think about our breathing and make ourselves feel comfortable and have positive thoughts, that is something that needs to be practiced with regularity, right? If those of you that do not play guitar, if I gave you a guitar now and I said, please play me a song, you would be like, no, I can't, I don't know how to play a song. But if you would take classes and practice throughout the year, next year, you probably can play a song. The same thing with positive thoughts. The more we practice, the better we get at it, and the easier these positive thoughts come to us. And we do need them. They do help our executive function. In terms of being present in the moment, in a non-judgmental way, where we can appreciate what's happening, be it whatever it be it pain, be it sadness, be it joy, being content, that helps our emotion regulation. And in the way that I just described before, right? Scientifically, it actually makes our amygdala function better, which means that when an experience happens to us, we're not going to encode that necessarily emotionally, but we're going to encode it with words. We're giving ourselves time to build a narrative with our improved executive function of, I went through X, Y, and Z, and I survived this, and this is how I did it. And that narrative is what becomes encoded, rather than the fear or the suspense or the something with no words attached to it. Children are very limited in their vocabulary, right? Sometimes we need to help them find those words. But notice how I said help them find those words, not tell them those words, because we don't want to be suggestive. Our experience is very different than theirs. Remember the gene environment interaction being different in every individual. And we want to do is we want to guide them with very open-ended questions so that they can find out their own words. Breathing is very important because breathing is an anchor to the moment. So it helps us with that mindfulness, right? Breathing is, in a way, in essence, what keeps us alive. So breathing is very much related to being alive. So the better we breathe, the better we live. And it is important, and we can say, oh, but we're always breathing, obviously, but we're not really always breathing to the extent that we can, to the extent that we can bring new, fresh oxygen into our body. And what that happens when it attaches to hemoglobin is that it goes to our muscle and it helps it relax. So there's a real physiology to this as well. As we do exercises, and I'll share some with you, we can think of breathing, think of executive function, and think of emotion regulation. Next slide, please. So take a breath, take any breath. You may have gotten to 1 to 2 to 3 in terms of the depth of your breath. What we want to do is we want to push ourselves to breathe even deeper, right? To really move that diaphragm down so that our lungs can expand and more air can come in. So we want to go to a count of 5, breathing like this. And then exhaling the same amount. Exhaling slowly as through a straw, right? I think Susanna is going to take us through the starfish exercise, which is an exercise of breathing that kids like a lot, and so do adults. So maybe Susanna will take us through that as well. And in terms of mindfulness and how to anchor in the moment, what do you mean? How can I do that? Well, one simple exercise is to maintain a pose like we did at the beginning, and Susanna told us but maintain any pose that you learn through yoga or exercise, such as the mountain pose. Another exercise would be to get those senses, not active because they're always active, but get us in touch with our senses, get our brain in touch with our senses by recognizing 5 things that we're seeing, 4 things we're hearing, 3 things we're touching, 2 things we're tasting, and 1 thing we're smelling. And we're sharing all of this with you because we want you to include it into your self-care if you feel is helpful and if you feel you want to add it to your toolbox. But we also want you to share it. We also want you to share it with your students and with the kids when they come back. And as we go through the day today, you'll see more examples and exercises of things that you can share. Next slide, please. Okay, so now Chi Kim would talk to us more about Pure Power, Brain Breaks, and other Pure Edge resources.
Thanks, Victor. Super excited, and thanks for all of that. I think you can get a good sense of how we're sort of trying to connect the way in which we function with our physical beings, and then also the way in which it's connected to sort of our calming strategies as well. I wanted to share just a few things as Victor was talking. You know, it's really all the prevention pieces. It's really for us in school-based models. So if you are part of a student success team at your school, or if you are building, if you're an administrator or building a culture of care, we know there's lots of different ways in terms of how we focus on ourselves and for self-care. We are talking about that because we do know that stress is contagious. And all of the information that Victor has shared with you, we also want to just be very, very mindful as when we set up our school structures, is how we're taking care of the adults. It is the way in which we show up into the space for our colleagues, for the children that we serve, that will have a huge impact on how information is received, how information is taken as well. So we just wanted to share a few models of just where self-care sort of fits into the mold. This is really from the adult side, but we can also think of how we can implement some of these self-care strategies in the school sense. And the reason why we do this is because we know that once you take care of yourselves and are really knowing how important you are to the work that you do, to your families and to your colleagues, we do know that having that sense of calm, a little sense of just how important you are, really matters exponentially actually to all of those around you. So we're going to go ahead and I'm sharing, next slide, Elizabeth. We have gathered with all of our materials, as Victor has said, our goal and our mission is to make sure that everything that we have is accessible and is free. So there will never be a cost for any of our materials or resources. And we focus on 3 simple things: breathing, moving, and resting. So when we breathe, move, and rest, we do know those are the strongest components. There was this that just sort of helps you reduce your own stress levels. There was a study that was just released by the University of Boulder, Colorado Boulder, that 5 minutes of intentional breath exercise actually had the same impact as 30 minutes of physical exercise, as well as medication for lowering one's blood pressure. So just wanted to share that all of the resources that we have are really based on research practices that have been around. Next slide. And what we have done for you is we've actually gone through and we've taken feedback from about 70,000 educators who've used our resources and our materials, and they've been giving us feedback. We've tried to break down these prevention exercises so that when you are starting with your tiers, your multi-tiered system of supports, tier 1 is really for all. And that includes the educators, including yourselves as well. So we've broken down into the simplest components. We have Pure Edge Brain Breaks, really simple, easy to access, anywhere from 1 minute to, for 5 minutes. And these are sort of transitional breaks throughout the day, the ones that Susanna has shared with you as well. Next slide. We also have a group on our website. It's completely free. There's a little access point where it says free curriculum. If you haven't signed up already, so maybe you can do that during the break. It's pureedgeinc.org. You get access to all of our curriculum, which is written in English and in Spanish. It's for pre-K all the way through grade 12. We have videos that are in English and in Spanish, and also we've added in for many of our Brain Breaks videos are ASL interpretation for accessibility. All of our English videos also have closed captioning as well. So just to make sure that we have that. And then our Spanish videos have Spanish closed captioning as well. Next. So we have, just to let you know, we have 1,200 pages of curriculum that none of you will ever use, but we have enough of the entree into self-care with the Brain Breaks and to have a full comprehensive curriculum if you choose to use in your school site. We have Pure Power Brain Breaks with Pure PE for mindful movement classes, and then also the Peek Inside the Amazing Brain. We've been asked by teachers who've used the curriculum to break down just the neuroscience unit. So that's what the Peek Inside the Amazing Brain is. And this week, if you've joined us, we're launching our Start with the Heart curriculum. What we've been asked to do is just, can you give us a simple way to implement these brain breaks but have some content? And so what we've done is actually launch pre-K, K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12, Start with the Heart curriculum. It's basically anywhere from about 10 to 12 short lessons, and you can embed the brain breaks strategies within them. And those are going to be available on our website by the end of the week, but all the videos are available now. Next slide. So we have training manuals, resources, and we have cards. We try to make it as kid-friendly as possible. So wherever the entree point is for your school or your classroom, there's a simple way to do that. So we always recommend brain breaks first. And then if you feel that you need more of a robust health and wellness curriculum, the one that was studied by Stanford, we have actually taken those components that have supported the sleep study, breathing, moving, and resting. And then we have more comprehensive approaches if there is a health and wellness course in your school. For those of you who are teaching at secondary or high schools, oftentimes they'll use it during either freshman seminar or some other times where they have a special unit of study. You know, several schools have gone away from traditional PE and they offer actual yoga and mindfulness classes as part of a quarter as one of their choices. It's similar to doing weightlifting or athletic training. Next slide. So right now, we know that you've been sitting and listening for quite a bit of time. And so we want to make sure that we give you a substantial break. We are going to just keep this session open. We're going to be off camera. We'll have just a little bit of 15 minutes bio breaks. If you want to go online, sign up for a free account. And again, everything that you're seeing here is offered at no charge. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. So if you sign up, you won't be asked for a credit card or anything like that, but you can download materials and tootle around there. But we'll be back in 15 minutes. We'll actually have our goal to be back at 2:20. So just take a little bit of a break. So we're back at 2:20, back online with our team. So thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm sure that I just kind of imagined everyone dancing as they were waiting on their break, just as Victor shared about exercise. I also think music and kind of letting your body do its thing with the rhythms is also really helpful, and also a very mindful activity as well, because you're sort of in it. So we're super excited to welcome you back and just share a little bit. As we're getting everyone sort of back into learning mode, I'm just going to launch a poll to see when you started your career in education, what was popular on the radio? What was popular on the radio when you started your career in education? Beatles and Rolling Stones, Bob Marley and Queen, Madonna and Prince, Nirvana and Mariah Carey, Britney Spears and Rihanna, Beyonce and Taylor Swift, or BTS and The Weeknd? So when you started your career in education, what was popular on the radio? So just give you about 30 more seconds to sort of weigh in. We'd love to hear from everyone. So let us know. I'm just going to leave the poll open for just a minute. We've got 53% voting. So if you just have gotten back to your computer and just logging on now, go ahead and just let us know what was popular on the radio when you first started your career in education. All right, so we're going to go ahead and share our results. So it looks like we're kind of evenly split. So Beyonce and Taylor Swift seem to be sort of at the high end with the 26%. And we're, I think, close to Madonna and Prince is when I started teaching as well. And we've got a little bit on the map. So we've got a nice range of experience. So thank you again for sharing a little bit of your musical, what was on the radio, and we're going to go right back in. So as soon as we are ready, I'm going to stop sharing that. And Elizabeth is going to go ahead and get our next presenter and speaker up and running. Thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Matla, you are on mute, as will be the most common phrase heard in this entire year.
Thank you. Thank you, G. I turned my camera on, but didn't click the other one. So here we go. Hopefully everyone can see me and hear me now. Let me know if not. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you all in this conversation and presentation. And so I'm going to speak a little bit to provide an overview of our treatment program for youth responses to adversity and trauma. This is the cue-centered therapy approach that Dr. Carrión mentioned earlier in his presentation. In its classic form, cue-centered therapy, or CCT, as I'll refer to it, is a tier 3 intervention. So for those of you that are working within MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, or multi-tiered, multi-dimensional systems of support models that look at the 3 tiers of intervention and support, this is classically designed, cue-centered therapy is classically designed as a tier 3 intervention. This is a psychotherapy program for youth that have clinically significant traumatic stress and related functional impairment. And when I say traumatic stress, I'm not just referring to the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that you may be familiar with, intrusive symptoms, re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance symptoms, hypervigilance, but also to the broad range of impacts and symptoms that kids might experience. You know that trauma can sometimes look like inattention, can show up as depression or anxiety. It can lead to behavior problems and relational difficulties and things like that. And so in CCT, we're trying to think broadly about all these impacts and work to address the range of difficulties or challenges kids have experienced. And while it is designed as a psychotherapy program that is a tier 3 intervention, there are also elements that overlap or align with tier 1 and tier 2 interventions. And so I will reference those as we get there, kind of mention some of those opportunities for overlap or integration in the course of my presentation. Again, CCT in its classic form is designed for delivery by trained mental health professionals, but we really encourage an integrated approach, especially in school settings. We know that the impact is maximized not when we're just doing therapy behind closed doors and in private spaces. Of course, we want to protect privacy and confidentiality of our clients, but it can be incredibly helpful when mental health professionals are integrating and interacting with teachers, with school staff, with school administrators, to consult with one another around the supports that kids need, to help the care team, the student success team really understand that how trauma is impacting or might be impacting a child's performance and presentation at school, and really working together to create a safe and supportive school environment. And so really encourage that sort of a collaboration across disciplines and across support providers at schools. And in our work in implementing CCT at schools, that's the approach that we've tried to take. And what we've seen, some of the findings that we've seen that Dr. Carrión referenced earlier, showing evidence to support the impact of CCT and improving functioning. A lot of that work was done in school settings. So there is an evidence base and there is empirical validation for this intervention, for this program. Next slide, please. And so cue-centered therapy really includes the core components of trauma intervention. We know what works for trauma treatment, and that includes psychoeducation to understand stress reactions and trauma reactions and to normalize those responses, an emphasis on skill development, particularly related to emotion identification, emotion expression, and emotion regulation skills. We know these are the 3 skill domains that are impacted by child stress and trauma exposure. So we're trying to build skills in these areas. We want to engage in a process of approach and exposure to the trauma experience, really to kind of counter avoidance that we know oftentimes drives trauma symptoms or post-traumatic stress symptoms. And then really leading towards trauma experience integration, helping kids to make sense of their experiences and help them arrive at an adaptive understanding of the role that trauma and adversity has played in their lives, but then also what they can do to manage some of those stresses and to continue to grow and move forward as individuals in their schools and families and communities. And so the underarching aim is really to promote youth empowerment, right, in overcoming the stressors and adversities that they may have experienced in their life. And again, this empowerment really happens in CCT through knowledge and through experience. And so for folks that have experience doing trauma work or trauma-focused therapy, the components of CCT will feel familiar, and that's by design, that's intentional. Again, we don't want to, we're not trying to recreate the wheel, and we really want therapists to bring their existing skills and experiences to this work. At the same time, CCT offers some shifts in conceptualization and structure. So I will talk a little bit about those shifts and the rationale for why we've developed CCT. So if we can move to the next slide, please, Elizabeth. So first of all, we know that trauma treatment is not one size fits all. We need a variety of approaches. There's a variety of contextual factors and presentations, all the different factors in the environment that influence the trauma response and that help shape what is the best fitting kind of intervention for an individual child. So we know trauma treatment is not one size fits all. And we also, and then we also know that exposure to chronic adversity and complex trauma, that is, multiple trauma experiences or different types of traumas at different stages of life is more of the standard rather than the exception to the rule. Unfortunately, trauma does not occur in isolation. And what we've seen in our work is that it's not just one simple, straightforward experience of trauma or adversity that kids are struggling with, but oftentimes it's multiple experiences of different types of adversity that range across the lifespan. And so CCT, this is one of the kind of conceptual shifts, is to focus more on this chronic or complex trauma over a focus on single circumscribed trauma experiences or incidents of adversity. As Dr. Carrión has mentioned earlier, CCT is also an insight-oriented approach, and there's rationale for this, right? And this is kind of the basis for CCT development, is that we want to help kids develop awareness of their experience. This is known as interoception. This is kind of, better understanding, better connection between mind and body, and kind of, developing awareness of kind of internal experience, right? And this is one skill that, relates to insight development, but is also that's facilitated by the brain breaks and check-ins that that we've conducted today, and that PeerEdge has offered some structure and guidance around. The insight-oriented approach also helps to facilitate children's helps to improve their understanding of the impact of life events. Sometimes trauma and adversity can be very confusing, very disorganizing in terms of our understanding of our experience, right? A lot of times we see fragmented or incoherent narratives of experiences of stress. And so CCT aims to address that. And again, all to kind of all with the aim of developing insight as a means of facilitating trauma experience integration and child empowerment. CCT was also aimed to address some of the common obstacles that we see in trauma treatment. I already mentioned some of the challenges and difficulties we've had in children identifying circumscribed or isolated trauma experiences. And we've also seen, particularly working in school settings, that there are challenges to caregiver participation. In CCT, we want to maximize and take advantage of caregiver or parent involvement as much as possible. At the same time, we recognize that there are significant barriers to bringing parents into the therapy work, especially when we're working in school settings. And so CCT really focuses on work with a child that includes some caregiver sessions, but the emphasis is really placed on working with the child to promote their independence and autonomy and sense of empowerment as they kind of go through the standard kind of developmental process. And CCT also acknowledges that multiple therapeutic techniques are relevant. So Elizabeth, if you can move us to the next slide, I'll pick up on that note. So CCT structure is really a multimodal and integrative approach. And so what I mean by that is that CCT really combines elements from cognitive behavioral therapy, from narrative therapy, from expressive therapies or exposure therapies, and also interpersonal or relational therapies. So, throughout CCT, you'll see elements of other evidence-based practices and therapy approaches, but again, with a focus on developing child insight. In its classic form, CCT is approximately 15 sessions, but we allow flexibility or suggest flexibility to tailor the number of sessions based on the needs of the child. You may add more sessions if you can have more parent or family work involved, or in some cases there may be reasons why you can move quickly through some of the sessions and maybe not require that 15 session structure. As I mentioned, it's primarily individual focused intervention. There are by design 3 or 4 conjoint child caregiver sessions when they're together, and we have seen the benefits of that, both for reducing child stress, but then also in some of our research and evaluation, we've seen that when parents are involved in this work, their own stress, their own depression, anxiety goes down. So we want to kind of take advantage of those opportunities, but at the same time, we're not entirely reliant or leaning heavily on like every day or every session parent or caregiver involvement, given some of the challenges and barriers that children and families experience. In this classic design, CCT is designed for ages 8 and above. This, with the emphasis on developing insight, older child, school age and above, and adolescent groups do best in its classic form, but we've also adapted and implemented CCT with younger age groups. It just takes some tailoring of the work, and we also believe that this is a relevant intervention or approach even for beyond childhood. But just to say, most of our, the research and evaluation that we've done have been primarily in the 8 to 18-year-old age range. And again, as I mentioned, CCT is really focused on chronic, ongoing, or complex trauma, but we believe it's suitable for any trauma type. And again, invite flexibility and tailoring of the intervention depending on the types of traumas and adversities that are relevant to the child that we're working with. So we can move forward, please. And so CCT is based really in trauma neuroscience. And this is a lot of information that Dr. Carrión presented earlier. And really in CCT, we aim to teach these concepts because we know that knowledge is empowering for kids. So it's really the structure of CCT and the content and the activities are based on trauma neuroscience, and for example, the interplay between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and how the dynamics between the kind of higher order executive functioning rational parts of our brain and the prefrontal cortex and the more emotional or instinctual responses of our brain lead to these survival responses, the fight, flight, freeze, cling reactions that we may see in kids as they're under stress or facing a trauma cue or trauma reminder in the school setting. So we anchor ourselves in that science. We think about also the links between what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the body, as Dr. Carrión already described, thinking about how these neurological fight, flight, freeze, cling reactions connect with what's happening in our body to activation of our HPA axis and the kind of physiological alarm that we experience, acknowledging the different ways that manifests or shows up for different kids. We also think about CCT is based on the idea of the allostatic load, which is basically the threshold model that Dr. Carrión was describing earlier, that our experiences of stress and adversity and trauma really accumulate over time and build up. And so we want to be thinking comprehensively about the various stressors, whether they're micro stressors or macro stressors that kids have experienced, and integrate that into the work, right? And this is where you see the image that you'll see multiple times in this presentation, this conversation of the young girl carrying a heavy backpack, right? This is the weight, this is the burden of her life experiences that she's kind of carrying with her in her everyday life. And so we want to acknowledge the multiple experiences, the multiple factors that have added weight to that backpack. And through the work, we're helping to build skills and strength and capacity to carry that backpack. We know that kids can do work to develop that strength and to be able to manage that load, but it takes some support, it takes a resource investment. We're also thinking about the intersections of trauma and development. understanding how experiences of stress and adversity and trauma during different developmental stages will impact kids' skills and their abilities and presentations, and also take advantage of this principle of neuroplasticity, that there are many opportunities for kids to develop positive connections or develop resilience, to develop new coping skills, given the opportunity that we have, while kids are still within this developmental process. And one of the core bases, one of the core principles on which CCT is based is classical conditioning. And so this is, in neuroscience, this is related to Hebb's rule, which is the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. And so in this, we're applying the understanding that trauma symptoms and trauma reactions are conditioned responses that get ingrained through repeated exposure to perceived threat and exposure to trauma reminders or trauma cues or triggers. So if we can proceed to the next slide, then I'll talk a little bit more about this, the application of this classical conditioning paradigm within CCT and how we frame it within CCT. So what you see here is the classic experiment, classical conditioning experiment. So taking you back to Psych 101 for those of you that have some background in psychology. And so you may recall, and hopefully this is familiar to many of the folks here, the paradigm where Pavlov and his dogs, right? Where you have an unconditioned stimulus, food that brings a natural, instinctual, automatic response, salivation when the dog sees the food. Through classical conditioning paradigms, that food gets paired with a conditioned stimulus, a formerly neutral stimulus in the environment that becomes associated with that food, in this case, the bell, to the point that through practice and repetition, eventually the bell brings along that formerly instinctual response, but now it's conditioned response of salivation, right? You don't even need the food, it's just the bell that brings that conditioned response. So this paradigm can be mapped directly onto trauma experiences, where we can think of exposure to trauma or exposure to threat as being that unconditioned stimulus. Then we have our natural survival instinctual response, right? Which can emerge across 4 domains of our thoughts, of our physiological reactions, our body feelings, our behaviors, and our emotions. And so there's natural links there that don't require any conditioning or learning. That's part of our biology and programming, right? But again, trauma does not occur in a vacuum. So what happens is many formerly neutral objects or stimuli in our environments, maybe certain sounds or smells, certain people or types of kind of presentations get paired with that sense of threat, right? And in that way, formerly neutral objects in the environment become trauma cues or trauma reminders. They become that conditioned stimulus, just like the bell. And what then happens is that these responses get ingrained, and then that leads to the emergence of trauma symptoms when those cues come back, later at different points in life, right? Maybe in the school setting or the classroom setting. And lots of time, this is what causes challenge for the student or for peers or for the teachers in the classroom. So this is the basis of CCT, and really what we're looking to do through the course of CCT is engage in a process of altering the link between the classically conditioned cue response. This happens through education, through knowledge, through empowerment, through increased understanding of what is happening, why it is happening. Really, we seek to teach this kind of cue conditioning paradigm in an age-appropriate way. But then also through exposure processes where kids kind of tell their stories and they begin to approach those formerly neutral but now emotionally charged trauma cues, but then at the same time practicing new adaptive responses through application of coping tools. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward, but this is one of the key components, the key background to frame CCT. So we can move forward. So a bit of a summary here, just to kind of review the aims of CCT. It's to help kids gain empowerment through knowledge, skills, and experience, to help kids identify and address the trauma cues, the formerly neutral things in their environment that are now interfering with their everyday functioning. We want to help and facilitate kids in approaching their trauma history to counter the patterns of avoidance and really help them express and process the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors they may experience related to the trauma history exposure. We want to help kids increase flexibility in responding to adversity and trauma and the reminders and the cues that they may encounter in their everyday lives. And again, when we're thinking about flexibility in responses, we're thinking across 4 domains depicted here by this square that really connects the things that we think, the physiological reactions, the things we feel in our body, the kind of feeling or mood states that we have, and also our behaviors or actions. And one of the, a slight departure from typical classical conditioning interventions that focus on extinguishing some of these cued associations. We're not looking to extinguish or replace some of the links between trauma cues and the survival responses, because we know in the face of ongoing threat or adversity, these may be protective responses that have helped kids survive. So we don't want to take that away from them, but we want to give them more options for what they can do, give them more choice and agency in deciding what is the appropriate response given the situation that I'm in. So this is represented by this cube, right? We're kind of layering multiple squares on top of each other, and then kids have the kind of option to select what's the one that's going to be helpful for me in my current setting. So all this is done with the aim to strengthen the children's connection with themselves, their caregivers, and their surrounding systems. And so we can move forward. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm just going to walk through. CCT is broken down into 4 primary phases. And in phase 1, we're really focused on psychoeducation and coping skills development. And so this is where we're teaching kids about this classical conditioning paradigm, how it relates to trauma, teaching them about the kind of 4 domains of reactions and responses to stress. And this is where, this phase 1 is really where CCT can really integrate and overlap with tier 1 and tier 2 supports. We can think about taking some of the CCT skills and teachings and delivering them as universal education about stress and trauma, or taking, other experiences that kids may have in learning about the neuroscience of stress, such as in the Pure Edge, Pure Power resources, and bringing this into the conversation around CCT, right? So there's a lot of opportunities for integration and collaboration between tier 1 interventions and the work that's done in therapy. Similarly, phase 1 also entails a process of learning and exploring different coping skills. We will introduce many coping skills and help kids build practice in mindfulness, in yoga techniques, in relaxation, but then also working with kids to identify the coping skills and the tools that they've used to kind of manage their stress in their own lives, right? And so we want to help kids really develop their own toolbox, right? Help them select the things that are most helpful for them. Again, we want to empower kids and respect their voice and their experience. But again, this is where CCT can really overlap and be bolstered by tier 1 and tier 2 supports. School-wide efforts to increase emotion awareness, emotion expression, emotion regulation skills that are promoted through brain breaks, for example. Really provide the skills and experiences that can go directly into the toolbox. When I've worked in schools and communities as a therapy provider, but in schools and communities that have had, for example, the Pure Power curriculum, kids come in already with a leg up. They already have the skills and experience and confidence that they can do some of these stress management techniques. And so, it really bolsters the therapy because they come in ready to go. And a lot of the time that we often spend introducing skills and building the skills, kids come in prepped and ready to go with that. And so it's really advantageous to be integrating these approaches in this work. Thank you, Elizabeth. And so in phase 2 of CCT, we really, this is focused on processing the chronic traumatic stress history. So we work with kids to develop a life timeline that identifies both their positive and negative life experiences. This is where kids start to really get to kind of tell their story, and there's such value in giving space for that. And some of the additional benefits of this life timeline process is that it starts to capture and visualize, create a kind of representation of that allostatic load that helps kids understand their experience and understand why they might be struggling in certain areas, right? And provides kind of validation in that way. Also, through the life timeline, we often have the opportunity to highlight kids' resilience in the face of adversity, because we can identify trends where they've bounced back or they've recovered after trauma and resilience. And so that provides an opportunity for us to kind of explore with them, well, what helped, what worked, what existing skills and resilience factors do you have that we can kind of bring into this work and you can really kind of acknowledge for yourself moving forward. So it's a very valuable activity that we include in CCT. From there, we also move into a trauma narrative and processing experience within the intervention. This is where we're helping kids to tell their story, including both the good and the bad aspects, and really process their thoughts and related to specific experiences of trauma. And this is then a skill or an experience and can get applied to multiple trauma experiences, and that kids can carry forward with them. And through all of this, the goal is to help kids shift their perspective of themselves. We want kids to move from seeing themselves as victims, which is often the case, to really seeing themselves as survivors who have done everything they can to survive adversity or to survive threat. And we, again, really working to acknowledge their strengths. And this is where we can apply some of the coping skills like positive thinking or reframing that Dr. Carrión mentioned earlier, to some of the specific trauma responses, the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors that kids experience, and really draw those connections and links through this processing phase of CCT. Then moving on to phase 3. In phase 3, we take all the work that has been done previously to really hone in on some of the cues that are most relevant, most important, and most impactful in the child's life. So what are those formerly neutral objects that now are serving as triggers to elicit the trauma response and some of the problematic or challenging reactions or behaviors that are coming up for kids? So we really be very explicit in kind of mapping the cue onto that four-cornered square, right? To really demonstrate the links between cues and kids' responses, but then also to help them identify the specific new responses or the coping tools that they want to apply in reaction and response to those cues or the emotional or behavioral or cognitive reactions that come up. So here we're just being very explicit about how kids are going to manage themselves and their environment when some of the trauma cues show up, and increasing their awareness of these cues. This leads into an exposure phase of CCT, where we're engaging in an intentional process of gradual exposure to the cues, right? This helps kids, this is an experiential process where kids begin to gain mastery over their experience. And the gradual exposure moves from active imagination in many cases, guided imagery, towards maybe a role play or a rehearsal of confronting that trauma cue, to, in many cases, an in vivo practice or kind of real life exposure to that cue. So kind of a step-by-step progression in that way. And one thing that I'll just clarify real quickly is that we're not conducting exposure to actual threats or to actual dangerous elements of the trauma, but again, those formerly neutral things that have become associated with the trauma response. So we never want to put a kid in danger or ask them, put them at some like actual risk in this exposure phase. But we're looking to give them experience in increasing flexibility in responding to those non-threatening, non-dangerous elements that have become associated with the trauma experiences. And lastly, in phase 4, we're really focused on integrating the prior experience, everything that I've described previously. This involves revisiting the trauma narrative, and we also see that we often see that at this stage of the therapy process, at this stage of CCT, there are significant shifts in how children and students see themselves and see their trauma experience. So it can be very valuable to revisit that narrative to reinforce some of the learnings and progress that kids make through this work. Obviously, we want to highlight all the strengths that kids have demonstrated that we've seen through the work with them. We do recognize and acknowledge that we're not necessarily going to resolve all challenges or all problems, and there may be some lingering sources of stress or lingering concerns. And so it's clearly important that we assess current needs to see if there are additional resources or follow-up supports that can be provided to kids. But we also want to really help them anticipate future stress, acknowledging, you see this graph here, the chart on the right, that reminds us that progress is not a linear process, right? And just because a child has gone through cue-centered therapy, has completed the intervention, obviously does not guarantee that they will not be exposed to some future stress or threat or adversity. So we want to prepare them for that. And, let kids know that sometimes they're, as they experience the kind of ups and downs that are part of life, when there's a dip in their functioning or they're feeling low, they might feel like they're back at the beginning of their journey, like they've gone nowhere, right? But we want to remind them that that's a temporary blip, right? And that they're really on course towards this gradual process of recovery, and they're not back at the beginning, that they have new skills, new experiences that they can use, that they can apply to the current stressor or new adversity that might show up in their lives to help them continue on this gradual progression towards growth and progress and recovery. And then, of course, we want to celebrate the work and celebrate the time together. And so that's an important element of this, the closure process. And so that is the CCT overview. Happy to answer any questions or talk more about that as we move towards Q&A, but I will pass it along to Dr. Carrión to give a little bit of a demonstration of CCT with a specific case.
Thank you, Dr. Madlow. That was great. A lot of information we know. Something that we're going to be sharing with you soon is actually an online site where you can go and grasp any of this concept. It's an online training on CCT. So we will share that in a bit. I want to underscore before the case study, I want to underscore 2 points made by Dr. Madlow that are very important. One is, he says it takes support to carry the backpack. And this is so true. And one of the ideas that lives out there is that children are resilient by virtue of being children. And in fact, there's nothing in the scientific literature that backs that up. Actually, science suggests the opposite, that children are more vulnerable. If we look at an event that happens like an earthquake or a trauma or a disaster of any kind, children develop symptoms at a higher percentage, a higher prevalence rate than adults do. So children are actually more vulnerable. That's why we take care of them. Do they have this potential for resilience? Yes, but it does take all of us to be involved in their lives, to give them the coping mechanism, teach them, develop their own tools, and really empower them and give them opportunities. The second point I want to underscore is that a lot of what Dr. Madlow was talking about was the importance of context and the importance of really not only looking at one point in time, but seeing how that activity or behavior the student is demonstrating, the meaning that it has in their life. So an example, a child is in a classroom and leaves the classroom running during some activity. And the teacher gets to the student and sends the student to the principal's office, right? Because he just left the class and started running outside of the class. In the principal's office, he might get information how he's been there a couple of times already and he's causing a lot of problems and a lot of trouble. But the real context of that behavior stems from the fact that a year prior to this, there was violence at home. And for this kid to run and get away in the safety of their bedroom or under the bed or God knows where was an adaptive coping tool. And that the body learned that so well that now when there's a cue, like the sound in the classroom getting high because of the activity that was happening, that the body reacts that way. This is not something that is naturally available to his consciousness, but it's something that one can gather by really learning about the life history of the individual. So context is very important. So to highlight some of the CCT principles, let me discuss this case study of Sammy. And Sammy is an 11-year-old boy who was brought to our clinic because of increased aggression toward his siblings. Mom reported that this was very uncharacteristic of Sammy's previous demeanor. She also reported decreased academic performance. Feeling guilty and confused, she reported to the authorities that Sammy's father had regularly abused her and the children physically and emotionally for a number of years. Sammy had been hit numerous times with metal bars, wooden rods, and bamboo sticks. Sammy's mother felt the boy's behavior was directed at her for breaking the family up. Mom and kids were now living in a new apartment after the father had been arrested and deported. Sammy had nightmares and difficulty sleeping, and he scored 32 in his PTSD reaction index, which accounts to moderate PTSD. So what we see here is a number of things. First, that there's something that changes in the individual after a traumatic experience and after stress, right? So we're looking at kids in the pandemic, and we see a behavior that is really uncharacteristic to how they were behaving a year prior or when we had our Zoom sessions. That really indicates a change, and that's different from a behavior that has been there long-standing. It associates it more with the stressful event. So the fact that it has increased, that is uncharacteristic, we see here the decreased academic performance, the impact on cognitive processing. So as you can see, when we're talking to you today about that second half of the curve and children experiencing these traumatic experiences, it is not only emotional, but it's actually cognitive. It's actually also about the processing of information. We see that mom is involved here, and mom has some guilt about what has happened. And I know that I've talked about cortisol as a predictor, high cortisol, that I've talked about activity of the amygdala as a predictor, lack of hippocampal activity. But to this day, the best predictor that in our laboratory we've seen for symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that impacts function is a behavioral one, and it's guilt. So whenever we see guilt, we want to hone on that. We want to work with that. And we want to understand what that guilt is about. Because here, the mom is at risk too. We see potential cues, right? Metal bars, wooden rods, bamboo sticks. But remember that people can also be cues. So for mom, the son, Sammy, can be a trigger. For Sammy, the mom can be a trigger. And that also needs to be taken into consideration. Stress and trauma, as we know from the pandemic, doesn't occur in isolation. It has repercussions. Here we see the repercussion of now living in a new apartment, probably meaning that they have to be in a new school, and also the separation of the father, right? And Sammy put this in very good words. I mean, you can have mixed feelings. He felt safer because he was not being physically abused, but not every time was a negative time with his father. So he missed going to the park, he missed having ice cream with him, as he lost him, really, as he was deported. And then we see those nighttime issues that we've been talking about. So this is the presentation. Next slide. So as you know now, the first phase of CCT involves education. So we educated Sammy and mom when available into PTSD symptoms. And that may help make sense of the nighttime episodes, because we can always think, oh, these are nightmares, but people necessarily don't link all of these behaviors together. And the nighttime episodes were very much linked with what he was experiencing. As he learned coping tools, he found that relaxation exercises were calming for him and also gave him a sense of control. And then once he had coping tools, then you're able to start the narrative. You want to do the coping tools before the narrative, because you want, as the narrative is being told, if there are emotions there, that they can handle those with the tools that they have. And also with support, with guidance, and a structure meant to avoid suggestion, right? Very open-ended questions. Not did you feel sad, but how did that make you feel? And then we started getting to his story. He now felt safe. His sense of security increased further as mom learned not to avoid him, because that's what we do with cues. We want to avoid them because of what they trigger in us. So without knowing, mom was not all the time there for him because he was a cue for her. But as I mentioned, he also missed his father. He did start putting pieces together that after these aggressive episodes, he felt confused, as in days, his heart rate would accelerate. So there was this physical component to this as well. And he would take out his feelings on his siblings, and he would feel guilty. We know about guilt now, and he would feel ashamed as well. Next slide. Sammy and his mother were introduced to the concept of cues, and his father's violence was explored as a fearful event. Cues surrounding this event were most commonly neutral, not good or bad, but were reminders to his brain of the traumatic event, right? The classical conditioning that Dr. Matlow introduced us to. Sammy stated that when mom came home, the slamming of the car door did remind him of his father coming home. And somehow his brain associated this cue to the aggression. And when exposed to the cue, the aggressive response would result. Sammy and his mother were taught how responses, like being aggressive towards the siblings, had 4 components: cognitive, physical, emotional, and behavioral. And only changing one of those, or working on one of those corners, helped change the others. So we concentrated on changing any of these components as a means to develop other squares, other appropriate responses. Remember, if we just concentrate in you must not do that, and that's the only square they have, we're basically asking them to give us the only tool they have. So we must supply them with additional responses before this problematic response extinguishes. Next slide. Although impossible to identify all pertinent cues, and we're not going to be able to do that because many of these get processed unconsciously, what we need is just a couple, a few of them, so that we can help make a connection between history and behavior. Children compartmentalize a lot, and they may know that something happened in their history. They may know that they have feelings, usually fear, sadness, and anger. Sometimes they don't have the words for those. And they may know they're doing behaviors that are getting them in trouble, but they don't necessarily see a connection that because this happened, I developed the symptoms that make me do this. And that connection is important to understand. The goal was not to get rid of the cues, but to be able to tolerate them as non-threatening. And you know, one of the things that mom said is like, oh, we should get rid of the car. And I'm like, no, you know, the car didn't do anything wrong. The car actually is going to help us overcome this response, strong response that we have to cues and triggers. And we use a process called behavioral desensitization, which is gradual exposure. First imagining the door slamming, then in the office, closing the door of the office as if it was the door slamming in the car. And then later in vivo, using mom as a coach with the car. And this helped Sammy develop a sense of self-efficacy as he was developing other ways of coping and processing discordant emotions. By termination, he was doing better at school, not arguing with his mother, not hitting his siblings, and feeling better about his accomplishments and his symptoms had decreased. Now, what did it, right? Is it the fact that now he understands classical conditioning? Is it the fact that he went through behavioral desensitization? Cue-centered therapy really holds with a lot of value the fact that he is an active participant who discovers how to address this issue, and in the process realizes that this is a normal reaction and that there's nothing wrong with them. I believe that's an important component of what's happening in CCT. Next slide, please. So this is a lot of information in a very short time. We actually have created a CCT online course as a tool for those that want to go and get it. This is actually the site. It is currently available free to those of you that are here. Eventually, it is part of a certification program where there would be a fee, but you can go and enroll now and learn these principles. The whole course takes about 6 hours. So in it, hopefully what we are learning is how to help the child come from this very burden, allostatic load, this very heavy backpack, to something that she can. It's not about getting rid of the backpack, right? Because that's not realistic, but something that we can actually carry and live with. And so this is one of the tools that we have for you. Dr. Travis Bradley now is going to present another tool that we call Bridge to Learning. And actually, before we do that, there's going to be a survey also. So let's see. I think she may share those with us then.
Yeah, so there's just going to be a short little quiz, right? Here we go. Let's see. The first one is, what items are true regarding cues? Cues can trigger psychological reactions. We should be able to identify all cues associated with a traumatic event. Therapists anchor on cues for exposure treatment. A and C are correct, or all of the above. So we're just going to give you a few minutes to take a look at those choices. All right, just about 15 more seconds. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and end that and share the results. It looks like the majority of you have chosen A and C are correct, and we're going to go ahead and Dr. Carrión, do you want to give us the answer?
Well, yes, A and C are correct. Cues can trigger physiological reactions, and the therapists anchor on cues for exposure treatment. And we don't need to identify all the cues associated with a traumatic event.
Great. All right, here we go. And we have another question. So question, let's see, regarding coping tools. I'm going to launch this poll. If you take a look, these should be limited to the ones we teach children. Children can identify their own coping tools. Children below the age of 8 cannot engage in deep breathing exercises. A toolbox provides a concrete way for children to remember their coping tools, or both B and D are correct. I'll just give you a couple minutes, or sorry, about 30 more seconds to answer this poll. You might be surprised that we're giving you a quiz, but we thought it'd be a nice way for recapping all the information that you received. So here we go. Go ahead and share those results. And it looks like the majority of you picked that B and D are correct. Professor Carrión, what do you think?
Well, I am very glad that you all agree that B and D, because that's the right answer. But let me add that not only children can identify their own coping tools, but in our work, we notice that when kids actually use their own, and this goes to self-efficacy again, the outcome is even better. So yes, we can teach them a lot of the things that we are discussing today, and they may find it helpful and they may put it in their toolbox. But if they find that listening to a song or having a glass of milk is something that really helps them, you do want to encourage them to add that to their toolbox as well.
Great, thank you. And question number 3, we're going to launch that poll. True or false? In Sammy's case, the fact that the fact that his mom brought him to therapy demonstrated that she is doing well and did not need support for herself. True or false? Sorry for the typo on this poll. True or false? In Sammy's case, the fact that his mom brought him to therapy demonstrated that she's doing well and did not need support for herself. I'll just give you about 10 more seconds to answer that, true or false. And here we go. This is the result. 97% of you chose false. And Dr. Carrión?
Yeah, one of the most challenging things it is false. One of the most challenging things about the families that we work with is that sometimes their support system has also experienced the trauma. So as we mentioned, mom already was feeling guilty, right? Putting her at risk. And she, although she did a very good thing of identifying that Sammy needed treatment, she probably also needs some type of support as well.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Dr. Bradley, you are on.
Thank you so much. So just wait for all my slides are pulling up.
Oh, you know what? I don't think I think I still have a few more slides, Travis. So if we can go back, and if the host can let me be on video, that would be great.
Dr. Carrión, can you turn yourself back on?
I can't. It says that the host stopped it.
Okay, let me see if I can get you back on. Let's try that. Did that work?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, I have a few more pieces to share with you after that impromptu quiz. Thank you for doing that with us. Hope you enjoyed it. And before Dr. Bradley talks about bridge to learning. So we've talked about a number of things. We've talked about mindfulness. We've talked about cue-centered therapy. What are some of the practical things that we can do? Some of this should not be overlooked. Conversation, communication is incredibly important to establish that connectedness, and safety that children need to be reassured about. So take time to talk, reassure safety, at least take the time to talk to let them know that the door is open, so that if they're not ready to talk right now, they can come when they want to and they feel they are able to talk. So take time to talk, reassure safety, limit exposure. If it's something that it's happening to them right now and they require safety, really concentrate on that. Structured regular routines should help when school start, and be a role model of self-care, right? If you do the mindfulness exercises at the beginning of the class or at the beginning of a meeting, they will understand the importance that these have. And of course, the Pure Power curriculum that we already talked about. And I don't know if we have shared with you the site, which is here again, pureedgeinc.org/curriculum gets you there. Okay, next slide. In this same area of self-care, what we're talking about is doing exercise. I already mentioned how yoga combines exercise with mindfulness. Our diet is important. Our social interactions are important. Not abusing alcohol and drugs is important. Communicate safety and security. This is something kids want to know. They want to know that, yes, we understand that all of this is happening, but are we going to be okay? If we are all wearing masks, is that going to be enough? And you can share with them as much information as you have to share with them. But we also need to know where they are, right? And we need to understand that context, and listening is what's going to get us there. Listening in a mindful way, which is a non-judgmental way with a lot of attention. When enforcing guidelines, be sensitive about anxiety, anger, or frustration, about not being in control of one's safety and health. And pay attention to the fact that maybe something that is happening in the school could be a trigger of something that they experienced this past year at home. Next slide. So in terms of modeling, not only self-care, but self-compassion and getting involved, being involved together in the community. How is the school going to take care not only of the classrooms, but the community in which it lives? That gives kids a sense of control because they're taking some action. Let them know that they can ask for help. And you all should also know that you can ask for help, right? None of us are alone here, and we need that connectedness to learn from each other. Remember to be particularly sensitive to those kids and families that have pre-existing mental health conditions, as they, with all the changes that have happened, it's important for them to continue their treatment and be aware of any more worsening symptoms. Next slide, please. And here are some examples of self-care again. We're repeating it a lot because that's how important it is. The connection is very important, and it's one of those things that was taken away from us this year, right? The fact that we could not be with our usual social connection group. If you have any questions, call healthcare providers, especially if you feel that stress is getting in the way of your daily activities, and make sure that in those activities you add activities that you enjoy. And don't watch the news too much, take breaks from that. Okay, now we're ready for Bridge to Learning.
Okay, thank you so much. Take two. So hello, everyone. Again, my name is Travis Bradley, and I'm really excited to share with you today a project I direct in the Stanford Early Life Stress Program called Bridge to Learning, which, as the name suggests, seeks to bridge the science of learning and educational practice. So in this part of the presentation, we'll continue to take a step back for a moment from the targeted psychological interventions and wellness practices we've been discussing, and consider more broadly some of the processes involved in schooling and suggest some principles for understanding and positively influencing educational systems. So to do this, we'll use the concept of motivation as our anchor. What is it? How do we get it? Why do we always seem to lose it? I'll talk about the importance of developing a social, emotional, and cultural lens. And I'll share details about how you can stay engaged with our work through a new online mini course on motivation and an opportunity to experience personalized coaching for yourself. Next slide, please. So first, it's important to remember that every child, indeed, every person is different. And like Dr. Carrión spoke about earlier, each of us develops at our own pace and in our own way within a multitude of individual, family, and community contexts. But we also share some really important features. Consider this quote: "Humans have evolved to be inherently curious, physically active, and deeply social beings." I invite you to reflect on these points, particularly as we explore motivation further today. Next slide, please. So what is motivation? Well, motivation is what gives purpose or direction to our behavior. In other words, motivation concerns what moves people to act, both consciously and unconsciously. And how does motivation look? Well, as educators, we might walk into a classroom and expect motivated students to look something like these folks. I mean, they're ecstatic, they're engaged. They apparently couldn't possibly be happier to sit in the classroom and soak up the knowledge from their teacher and to participate in learning. Next slide. But we as educators know that the reality is that that motivation in classrooms often looks more like this. Maybe students are on their phone, appearing to daydream, falling asleep, chatting. So in everyday circumstances, when we think about motivation, it's often in terms of a motivation or a state in which a student seems to find no real value, reward, or meaning in learning, and demonstrates a lack of intention to engage in what we would consider typical learning behaviors. But motivation is actually much more complex than this. It's not simply that some students are motivated and others are not. We're all motivated by something. And the environments we inhabit and the social support we receive dramatically influences us. Next slide. So consider that modern schooling often requires teaching mandated curricula to large, diverse groups of students based not upon an individual student's naturally developing interests and abilities, but rather upon a prescribed age-graded schedule reflecting some common notions about college and career readiness. Further, the behavior of students in schools is highly constrained through the use of rewards and punishments. This includes punitive disciplinary practices and a prominent and often public grading system that encourages strong social comparisons that may evoke feelings of inadequacy, shame, and resentment, even for those students who appear to excel on the surface. Next slide. So what does this mean for our students? Well, in a recent study conducted by the nonprofit Challenge Success and NBC News, researchers surveyed about 75,000 high school students from 86 high schools across the country from fall 2018 through fall 2020. They found that 56% of students report their stress about school had actually increased during this time. Only 35% of students reported that they were quite or very confident in their ability to cope with stress. And this percentage was even lower for those who identified as female, 24%, and 31% for those who identified as Hispanic or Latinx students. And finally, 43% said the amount of sleep they were getting actually decreased since the time before the pandemic. So students weren't sleeping that well before, and they're certainly not now, many of them. Next slide. It's also important to remember that separate from and in addition to the general stress that students may be experiencing about school, many students also struggle with mental health difficulties that can hinder success in traditional academic settings. According to the National Alliance on Mental Health Illness, 17% of youth ages 6 to 17 are found to experience a mental health disorder. What these statistics reveal is that students have rich inner lives and lives that extend beyond school, and many aspects of the whole child interact with and find expression in the classroom environment. Next slide. Oh, next slide. Thanks. So in addition to the contextual aspects of any particular task, there are many other factors that may be relevant for a student or teacher at any given time. These factors may serve to disrupt or disturb one's attention, motivation, and overall emotional health. Some common factors include negative mood, which is a low intensity negative emotional state that may persist hours, days, or even weeks. Dissociation related to traumatic stress, which can look sometimes like spacing out or forgetfulness. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. This is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders of childhood, and indicators can include impulsivity, attention difficulties, fidgeting, frequent interruptions, messy work, and difficulty starting or stopping a task. And finally, adverse childhood experiences, which can include experiencing or witnessing violence, abuse, or neglect, a death in the family or community, and divorce or parental separation. And certainly there are many, many others. Next slide. But school mental health is not just for students. According to a study by Lever, Mathis, and Mayworm, 46% of teachers in K-12 settings report high levels of daily stress during the school year. 10% of teachers leave after 1 year. 17% of teachers leave within 5 years. And an astonishing 70% of teachers in urban districts leave within the first year. When compared to 12 different occupational groups, teachers are the least likely to state they agree with the statement, "At work, my opinion seems to count." So classrooms are where students and teachers spend most of their day. And as such, our schools should be places of enduring support. But many students and teachers are not feeling supported. Next slide. So that's why in all of our work, we emphasize mastery of content and also well-being. I think this is a really great description of wellness. Quote, "Wellness is better described in terms of thriving or being fully functioning rather than merely the presence of positive and absence of negative feelings. Thriving is characterized by vitality, awareness, access to, and exercise of one's human capacities and true self-regulation." End quote. So wellness isn't only about feeling good, though that is really important too. It's also about the capacity or potential of individuals to personally achieve and substantively contribute to their communities. Next slide. So returning to this concept of motivation, we ask, what moves people to act? Next slide. Well, here's one perspective. This comes from the scholars Ryan and DC, whose influential research, along with Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck's work on mindset theory, has really shaped our understanding of motivation in schools over the past couple of decades. There is significant scientific evidence that human beings have 3 basic psychological needs. These are autonomy, competence, and relatedness, also called belonging. Each of these needs is distinct from one another, but as this diagram indicates, the needs are also interrelated. Each need facilitates the satisfaction of the others under most conditions, and the satisfaction of all 3 needs is essential for individuals to be fully functional. This means, for instance, environments that are structured to support autonomy will also facilitate satisfaction of competence and belonging, while controlling environments may hinder autonomy as well as competence and belonging. Next slide, please. So what exactly are these concepts? Autonomy is regulation by oneself rather than feeling controlled or pressured by external or internal forces. Autonomy is the need of individuals to experience a sense of volition and willingness, a self-endorsement and ownership of their actions. Autonomous actions are congruent with our authentic interest and values. Competence is about feeling effective and the satisfaction that comes from producing desired effects through one's own efforts. And finally, relatedness or belonging is a feeling that we are able to care and support others and feeling that others care and support us. Next slide. So one way to think about the relationship between one's environment, need satisfaction, and motivation is the autonomy control continuum. There's much more to it than this, but essentially contexts that support one's sense of autonomy also increase satisfaction of all three basic needs and enhance motivation. Next slide. So one way to bring this back to practice then is to ask, in any situation, does this activity, lesson, practice, or policy support or hinder students' sense of autonomy, competence, and belonging? Next slide. So consider for a moment these two teacher profiles and sets of classroom conditions. The profile on the left we call autonomy hindering. Here, the teacher seems rather uncaring. She does not greet students and rarely inquires about their well-being. She rarely offers students choice in how or when to complete assignments. This teacher discourages dialogue, delivers extended didactic instruction, and monitors students' silent, independent work. She demands compliance and rarely states the rationale behind decisions and requests. And finally, this teacher criticizes students' abilities, effort, or performance, and makes her positive attention or affection towards students dependent on their compliance. Now contrast this with the profile on the right, which we call autonomy supporting. Here, the teacher greets students with a smile, warmly, and asks how they're doing. He frequently offers students a degree of choice within the parameters of each lesson. He encourages students to engage in structured, academic, and social conversations. He generally provides explicit rationales for his requests and decisions. And he communicates high expectations for students, praises student growth on tasks, and encourages progress. So we can ask ourselves, which classroom environment would we prefer? These are just a few of the ways educators can support satisfaction of students' basic psychological needs. There are many, many others, but some important shared features include regulating one's emotions in healthy ways, something we've talked about today, showing care, using non-controlling language, offering meaningful feedback, and providing opportunities for social connection with peers. And I would add to that physical movement. Next slide, please. So one way we can conceptualize all of these practices and organize them into a more coherent fashion is through the use of frameworks. I wanted to share these two frameworks with you. The one on the left, you're probably already very familiar with. It's the social and emotional learning framework from CASTLE, also known as the CASTLE wheel, which represents 5 core SEL competencies. The framework on the right was created by the Center for Reaching and Teaching the Whole Child. And it's really meant to represent the more concrete processes and actions called teacher moves involved in developing what they call a social, emotional, and cultural lens. It's also notable for its integration of SEL and culturally relevant pedagogy. So on the right, within these anchor competencies, we see many of the things folks have talked about today. For instance, building trusting relationships with students may involve developing rapport and employing trauma-informed practices. Fostering self-reflection can include recognizing and managing our own emotions. Fostering a growth mindset can include articulating, affirming counter narratives, and shifting to positive self-talk. Cultivating perseverance by helping students set and monitor goals that are important to them, and by providing asset-based feedback, and so forth. So if you visit the center's website, you'll find some more creative ways to implement these practices in classrooms. But the focus of the social, emotional, and cultural lens is not a specific curriculum or practice. It's an example, just one example, of a holistic way of viewing social, emotional, and academic success, and for putting autonomy supporting principles into action. Okay, next slide. So I also wanted to share these quotes from the creators of that last framework, because I think they really drive home the point that I'm trying to make here. The creators of the framework are teachers and teacher educators, and this is from their book, Teaching with a Social, Emotional, and Cultural Lens, a framework for educators and teacher educators, published by Harvard Education Press. So quote, "These practices are not separate from pedagogy in math and science. They anchor that pedagogy in the kinds of interactions and environments students need to learn everything else." End quote. The next excerpt, quote, "After all, we cannot expect teachers to model and teach something they have not experienced themselves. And we cannot expect a safe and supportive classroom environment to blossom amid a punitive, toxic, or competitive culture among faculty or district staff. Furthermore," I love this part, "students are acutely aware of the adult cultures around them. And especially as they approach adolescence, they are experts at spotting hypocrisy," end quote. I think we all kind of know this, and it's why in our work, we really want to emphasize how important these practices are for students, of course, but also for the adults who care for them. This approach is about improving the school experience for students, but it's also about making teaching more fun. And next slide. Great. So wrapping up my time, if you found any of this content on motivation and the social, emotional, and cultural lens interesting, and you're eager to learn more, I want to end by sharing 2 opportunities for staying engaged. First, our project is looking for reviewers for a new online non-credit mini course we're developing on motivation, where we'll cover many more topics, including intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, orientation styles, goal content, interpersonal relationships, purpose development, how to have motivation enhancing conversations, mental health consideration, and tips for applying motivation science in the classroom. And next slide. But wait, there is more. Next slide. We're also looking for educators who are interested in participating in a pilot personal coaching program. Coaching practice draws from many of the concepts I've already covered today. There are many different approaches for coaching, but essentially, coaching is a structured, collaborative conversation and partnership grounded in multimodal learning methods and psychological approaches for enhancing performance and well-being in personal, academic, and work domains. Coaching is understood, importantly, to be voluntary, values-based, strengths-based, solutions-focused, and goal-oriented. And coaching techniques can include active listening, affirming coachees' values, strengths, and past successes, asking good, open-ended questions to encourage reflective thinking, supporting goal setting and problem solving, modeling skills, including emotion regulation, organizational and communication skills, providing constructive feedback, and encouraging self-directed change. So many of the things we've already discussed throughout our webinar today. Next slide. In the past several years, trauma-focused researchers have been instrumental in helping educators and others shift figuratively from asking students what's wrong with you to asking students what happened to you, to better understand how a child's environment affects their development and what a difference that has made. Coaching and other strengths-based approaches takes this ethos one step further and ask individuals also what's right with you. And how can we build on individuals' authentic values and interests and their strengths to enhance well-being? And last slide, I believe. Yes. So again, if you are interested in being a reviewer for the motivation course or participating in our personal coaching program this fall, in which you yourself will receive a series of online personalized coaching sessions, we ask that you please complete our expression of interest survey using this link in the slide at your earliest convenience. There are limited spots available for the pilot. So if you're not selected for this initial offering, don't fret. We hope to roll out the program to a wider audience later in the school year, and we will notify all respondents when that becomes available. Finally, if you have any questions, feel free to email the project and myself at bridge2learning@stanford.edu. And yeah, thank you all so much for your time and attention today. So much appreciated. And now I will, I believe, turn this over to Susanna for a closing mindfulness practice.
Thank you very much, Travis. So we're going to work on our self-care again. And before doing this optimistic closure, and thinking about our future me, I would like you to do one of our favorite brain breaks from Pure Edge that is called the starfish breathing practice. So I think we have been sitting down for a while. So if you want to stand up, you can do it, you can stand up and do it with the mountain pose, with the legs open to the width of your arms. And with your right hand, you can be sitting down as well if you want to keep sitting down. But with your right hand, I don't know if you can see me in the screen, but open the fingers wide open and imagine that your hand is a starfish. And with the index finger of the other hand, just move the hand as you breathe in through the nose, move the finger up. And as you breathing out, move down the finger. And we are going to do the all control of the hand. So breathing in, finger up, breathing out, finger down. Inhale, breathing up. Exhale, breathing out. Inhalando, exhalando. Breathing in, breathing out. Inhalando, el dedo hacia arriba. Exhalando, hacia abajo. And we come back. Breathing in, finger going up. Breathing down. Breathing in through the nose. Breathing out. Inhalando, subimos el dedo. Exhalando, bajamos el dedo. Breathing in. Breathing out. And breathing in. Inhalando and exhale, exhalando. And this is a brain break, and it's great. Children love this one, and adults as well. And we love this because you use your eyes, you use the skin. It's another sense. You use the movement because you move your finger, and you use your breathing. So it's a really interesting exercise to practice, and I encourage you to do it. And now we're going to do this, another exercise. It's called the future me. So I would like you to take a moment to write a note to your future self. So if you, if you can grab pen and paper And I think it's better to put these things in writing. So we leave you like a couple of minutes, maybe 2 minutes, to think what reminders of how are you feeling right now do you want to capture in writing. Remember, how are you feeling right now? Self-check. And what reminders do you want to capture in writing? And the second thing that we would like you to write is, what message of encouragement do you want to send to yourself, to your future self? So we leave you for a couple of minutes. Grab pen and paper, write it down. You can take a notebook, a post-it, something that you can take it whenever you want. And whoever wants to share it with us, we would love to listen to the Q&A box. You can write it down if you want to share. And I will come back soon. If you don't want to share, it's okay, you keep it for yourself. But it's good if you do the exercise in writing. Just have more minute. Great, so if anyone wants to share, you can put in the Q&A. And if it's personal and you want to keep it for yourself, just keep the note in a place that you can see it and that you remember how are you feeling and what note, a note of encouragement that you want to share. Thank you. Great. So keep this note for yourself. And we're going to go to the next slide, please. And we're going to do another of the brain bricks that PureEdge suggests. And it's called the guided rest. Remember the movement, the breathing work, and the guided rest. The rest is very important. So I encourage you to find, maybe this exercise is great to do it lying down. If you want to keep sitting down, it's okay. But if you want to lie down, it's great as a final exercise, a final mindful exercise. And if you have a couch available, or a mat or floor, whatever place that you can find for yourself. And again, start breathing through the nose, if possible, breathing out as well through the nose. If not, the mouth is great as well. Close your eyes or keep a soft gaze, legs and arms uncrossed. If possible, palms up, palm of the hands up. Start feeling how the air feels in your body, enters your body, and how the air comes out of your body. Breathing in and breathing out. And bring your attention to your body. We're going to do like a scan, a body scan with our attention on our brain. So I would like you to start from the toes. Bring your attention to the toes, the fingers. You can move them a little bit just if you want to feel them. Sometimes it's difficult to feel the toes. toes, the feet, the sole of the feet. Bring your attention to the heels, going a little up, shins, calf. I'm going to do it in Spanish as well, for the Spanish speakers. Con los ojos cerrados, lleven su atención a la respiración, al cuerpo. Empezamos por los pies, los deditos de los pies, la planta, el empeine, el talón, pantorrilla, los gemelos, the knees, las rodillas, thighs, los muslos, notando cómo el aire llena el cuerpo, llena esa zona que vamos describiendo. Feel how the air feels in your body, reaches this part of the body that we are describing. Breathing in and breathing out. Inhalando y exhalando. Subimos por la cadera, the hips, the stomach area, the internal organs, cadera, el estómago, los órganos internos, también muy importantes, the chest, the lower back, the middle back, the upper part of the back, the spinal cord, el pecho, la parte baja de la espalda, los glúteos, la parte media, las lumbares, la parte alta de la espalda. Bring your attention to your shoulders, moving down the arms, the elbows, the forearms, los hombros, los brazos, antebrazo, codo, and the hands. Bring your attention to the hands, the fingers, the space between the fingers. Think of all the things that the hands do every day. Atención, lleven la atención a las manos, a los deditos, el espacio entre los dedos. Piensen en todas las cosas que hacen las manos todos los días. La palma, el dorso. Going back to the shoulders, the neck, the throat, the head. Volvemos al cuello, la garganta, por dentro, la cabeza, la cara, the face, the eyes, the forehead, the eyelids, eyelashes, cheeks, the nose, the mouth, the lips, the tongue. Bring your attention to all these parts of the body, la cara, la frente, cejas, pestañas, los mofletes, los labios, la lengua, the temperature, the mouth, la temperatura dentro de los labios, de la boca, the chin. Breathing in and breathing out, feeling all these parts. all your body, being aware of all the parts of your body, the hair as well, el pelo, estando atentos a todas estas partes del cuerpo que estamos hablando. Breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out, inhalando, exhalando. I'm going to read you a poem to close this practice. It's from the Book of Love, from the great poet Rumi, Book of Love, and it's an excerpt, and it goes like this. Love is not condescension, never that, nor books, nor any marking on paper, nor what people say of each other. Love is a tree with branches reaching into eternity and roots set deep in eternity, and no trunk. Have you seen it? So slowly and gently, we start moving, toes, fingers, open the eyes, gently coming back to the final moment, the final part of this webinar that we're almost finishing. It has been a pleasure to be here with all of you. And now I think Dr. Carrión and Chi Kim are going to talk about final thoughts and conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you all for joining us today. Before Chi Kim does the final closing, I just want to review these 3 points of observation, listening and being open and non-judgmental, of identifying who may need what and the different spectrum of resources that we may need, and then the application of those resources and those tools. So I know that we've given a lot of information, but it boils down to observing, identifying, and applying. And very quickly, we went here through a slide of resources and a number of links. Those will become available to you, and Shikim will talk more about that. Thank you all.
Thank you, Victor, very much. And we just want to share our gratitude for you spending 3 hours with us today during your summer break, or maybe it's not your break and this is just part of work. A couple of housekeeping items. We're going to close with 3 questions for you as a poll, but I also wanted to make sure that you know that you're going to get a copy of the presentation slides on PDF. I'm going to follow up email within 24 hours, so you'll get it tomorrow. The recording of this session will be available on our website within by Thursday, I believe Thursday afternoon. And you'll also be receiving a certificate of completion for the 3 hours that you spent with us. So that will also be coming in the email. So I just want to make sure those 3 are addressed. So we're going to go ahead and launch the first question. Just as a closing reflection for you, I feel increased competency after completing this training. Do you strongly agree, strongly disagree? Just going to leave that up for a minute. It's a lot of information. We appreciate you just taking the time to give us a little bit of feedback. We do have another session coming up in August. It's the same one, but we just wanted to make sure that we have that available as well. Great. So we're going to end the poll. So it looks like there are the majority of you agree and strongly agree that you have increased competency. So we appreciate that. And the second question now is, I am now more ready to welcome my kids to their classroom. And if you are in a different capacity, not a classroom teacher, but you're a part of a school success team, be the same. Do you feel like you're more ready? And truthfully, we know that if you've committed yourself to even being here with us, we know that you're deeply committed, so we appreciate it. We just want to keep sharing that we're so grateful for what you do every single day. So we're going to go ahead and share the results. And it looks like the vast majority of, or almost about 87% of you agree that you're ready to welcome them back. And it's our last question for today. And it is, I know what to do if I need help with kids demonstrating distress. I know oftentimes we've shared this quite a bit too. It's not just your students or the kids demonstrating distress, but oftentimes it might be your colleagues. So are there ways in which that you can find ways to help them gain access to tools or someone that they might be able to connect with? Just give you another 15 seconds to answer that. Perfect. And it looks like a 94% of you. So again, we just appreciate everything that you do for children every day in your capacity as an educator. And we are so grateful that you're able to join us. All of our resources are always free and accessible. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at getmoving@pureedgeinc.org. And we're just grateful that you're here. So thank you again for spending the time, and to the Stanford team, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for everything that you've done for us as well. So with that, we are going to bid a fond farewell to everyone. So thank you and have a great, great afternoon.